Federalist 47, Part 4. We'll start with paragraph 13. Just make sure, please, that if you're going through these the first time, you have the Federalist Papers in front of you or on the screen and follow along. The Constitution of New York contains no declaration on this subject, but appears very clearly to have been framed with an eye to the danger of improperly blending the different departments. It gives, nevertheless, to the executive magistrate a partial control over the legislative department, and what is more, gives a like control to the judiciary department, and even blends the executive and judiciary departments in the exercise of this control. In its council of appointment, members of the legislative are associated with the executive authority in the appointment of officers, both executive and judiciary, and its court for trial of impeachments and correction of errors is to consist of one branch of the legislature and the principal members of the judiciary department. So, separation of powers is what Madison is looking at, and he gives a lot of credit to Montesquieu for writing the spirit of the laws, for believing in separation of powers, for having looked at the British system. But Madison says maybe he didn't look at the British system closely enough, and our state constitutions here at all, like we are doing right now, to see that there should be a partial agency from one branch upon what the other branches do. So they have to have some sort of check on one another. And Madison, Publius, Federalist, disagrees with anti-Federalists that they say you have to have these three branches 100% distinct and separate. Madison says it won't work. It won't work because we actually have learned from experience that there should be an agency. They should have a little bit of control on one another, and that's what we've done in most of our state constitutions. The next paragraph, the Constitution of New Jersey has blended the different powers of government more than any of the preceding. The governor, who is the executive magistrate, is appointed by the legislature, is chancellor and ordinary or surrogate of the state, is a member of the Supreme Court of Appeals, and president with a casting vote of one of the legislative branches. The same legislative branch acts again as executive counsel of the governor, and with him constitutes the Court of Appeals. The members of the Judiciary Department are appointed by the Legislative Department and removable by one branch of it on the impeachment of the other. So see, these are all have partial agency on one another. They are not 100% distinct, separate. According to the Constitution of Pennsylvania, the president, who is head of the executive department, is annually elected by a vote in which the legislative department predominates. In conjunction with an executive council, he appoints the members of the judiciary department and forms a court of impeachment for trial of all officers, judiciary as well as executive. The judges of the Supreme Court and justices of the peace seem also to be removable by the legislature, and the executive power of pardoning in certain cases to be referred to the same department. The members of the Executive Council are made ex officio justices of peace throughout the state. Again, look, there's so many connections here in every state constitution that partial agency is given to one branch in relation to other branches. They are not 100% distinct and separate. Then he goes, in Delaware, the chief executive magistrate is annually elected by legislative department. The governor is elected by the legislative department. The speaker of two legislative branches are vice presidents in the executive departments. The executive chief with 6 others, appointed 3 by each of legislative branches, constitute the Supreme Court of Appeals. He is joined with legislative department in the appointment of other judges. Throughout the states, it appears that the members of the legislature may at the same time be justices of the peace. In this state, the members of one branch of it are ex officio justices of the peace, as are also members of the executive council. The principal officers of the executive department are appointed by the legislative, and one branch of the latter forms a court of impeachment. All officers may be removed on address of the legislature. So again, these are all connected. Maryland has adopted the maxim in the most unqualified terms, declaring that the legislative, executive, and judicial powers of government ought to be forever separate and distinct from each other. Her constitution, notwithstanding, makes the executive magistrate appointable by the legislative department. Even Maryland, who has said these branches have to be totally distinct from each other, they have made it in a way that the executive magistrate appointable by the legislative department, and members of the judiciary by the executive department. The language of Virginia is still more pointed on this subject. Her constitution declares that the legislative, executive, and judiciary departments shall be separate and distinct, so that neither exercise the powers properly belonging to the other, nor shall any person exercise the powers of more than one of them at the same time, except that the justices of county courts shall be eligible to either house of assembly. Yet we find not only this express exception with respect to the members of the inferior courts, but that the chief magistrate with his executive council are appointable by the legislature. So the governor and the council that advises the governor are appointable by the legislature. He says there is a partial agency here. These are not 100% distinct. That 2 members of the latter are triennially means every 3 years, displaced at the pleasure of the legislature. And that all principal officers, both executive and judiciary, are filled by the same department. The executive prerogative of pardoning also is in one case vested in the legislative department. The Constitution of North Carolina, which declares that the legislative, executive, and supreme judicial powers of government ought to be forever separate and distinct from each other, refers at the same time to the legislative department the appointment not only of the chief executive chief, but also of principal officers within both that and the judiciary department. So he says, look, we've gone through all of these. There are 2 are left, South Carolina and the Constitution of Georgia. Up to now, as you can see, everything we've looked at, even though the Constitution says they should be distinct branches, you see that they have agency. Because without it, it would have been difficult to set up a system that works, does not constitute a tyranny, separates power, and respects the most important part, the rule of law. A law that applies to everyone the same. The law that will be applied to the rich and poor the same. The law that will be applied to all the people that are in office right now, whether they're representatives, senators, judges, after they step out of office, the law will apply to them too, equally. So there's just a small part of 47 left. I'll come back and finish it in part 5.